Perfect, cool. I shall begin. So thank you for having me back. I'm going to be talking about GitHub Actions for PHP devs, just like I did last time, but we're going to take it a step further this time and be talking about building custom actions, both generally building custom actions as well as using PHP to build those custom actions. So if you don't know who I am, my name is Ryan. I blog at ryangjchandler.co.uk. You can find me on Twitter and GitHub. I do a lot of open source stuff, quite active on Twitter. I'm a Laravel developer and JavaScript as well, but mostly Laravel and PHP these days. Yeah, let's get going. So the agenda for this talk, we're going to be talking about action configuration. So covering how to configure your own custom actions. We're going to be talking about getting Docker set up specifically for those custom actions. We're going to look at some PHP stuff, and we're also going to look at retrieving action input. So this is the typical sort of workflow that you'd have, probably one of the first steps that you write inside of a workflow in 99% of scenarios. So you've got the job key, the name of the job, the OS that it's running on, as well as some steps. And here we're saying checkout code and the action name. This is a more complex workflow action that you can use. PHP people might know this action. It essentially just auto commits any changes in the workspace. And this one requires some input arguments. So we have this with key, and we can pass through keyed values, and they will be passed through to the action. And all of these actions are kind of built the same underneath. They have some sort of configuration file, they have an entry point or an action handler, and then they run some scripts or some lines of code, and they do actions. So in this case, it's git auto commit, so it's committing stuff to the Git repository. The previous one, the checkout one, is just checking out the repository. So action configuration, all of this begins a very single file, and it's an action.yaml file. So this is the main configuration file for your action. It's the one where you're going to be defining the input requirements, the output requirements, as well as how it's going to be run. So let's take a look at a very basic one. So we have a name, everything has a name. In this case, I'm calling it migrate action. And we also have a description. So it's going to be a great action. So that's the description. And we can also define some inputs. So like you saw a second ago with the commit message argument, that's actually an input that will get passed through to the action itself. And these are defined in a similar fashion to steps and the with array. So we have the name of the input. In this case, it's name. And we also have a description. So this is the person you'd like to greet. And we also have whether it's required or not. So you can require inputs to be given to your action. So you can ensure something's available. You don't have to worry about adding checks in, for making sure things are empty. And we have another one. We have greeting. So again, a description. This time it's not required, and we're giving it a default value of hello. So this is very basic key value object syntax inside of YAML. So let's move on a little bit as well. So we've defined some inputs for a custom action. We've given it a name, we've given it a description, and we can also say how it's going to run. So if you're not aware, there's two types of custom actions as far as GitHub are concerned. You have a JavaScript action. So GitHub provide you with some NPM packages that you can install into a JavaScript project, and they provide some helpers for retrieving input, setting output, making certain assertions. And the other type is a Docker action. And this is where the power of GitHub Actions really comes into play, because you're not restricted to just JavaScript. You could run any Docker container you want. You can build that and configure that however you want. So we're going to be using Docker in this example. So we're going to put this using key in, and we're going to specify Docker. And we're going to be building a custom image. So in most Docker scenarios, it's going to be a Docker file that is configuring that image. And yeah, let's jump into VS Code real quick. So Actually, let's go to Safari. So I've got a repository set up already on GitHub. It's very basic. We've got this action.yaml file that I was just talking about. And let's just jump straight into it. This is exactly the same thing, near enough, that I just showed you on the slides. So we've got the name, the description, all of the inputs here, and this runs key. I'll get down to the args in just a second. So looking at this, there's a couple of things that we haven't created yet. So we need to create a Docker file. So we can do that right now. Let's just create a Docker file.
Ryan, is it possible to bump the font size up slightly? Just make it
yes, of course.
Thank you.
Is that better?
Yeah, that's a lot better. Thanks.
Perfect, cool. Yeah, so we've created a Docker file. And like I said before, this is going to be where we configure the Docker container itself, the image. And if you're not familiar with Dockerfile, don't worry. There's only going to be a few instructions that we use here. So we'll start from the very top, and we'll use the from. And now from is what you use to specify the base image that you're going to be using. So we'll start off very simple just by writing a shell script. So we don't need PHP or anything quite yet. And Alpine is a very popular Docker image, a base image to use because it's very lightweight. You still have access to the shell. You can install PHP, Composer, Node, all of that stuff, but it's very lightweight. You haven't got to boot up an entire Ubuntu server or image to run your stuff. And we're also going to lock this down. So we're going to say 3.10. So this is the tag, the specific tag that we're going to be using. We also need to give it some input. So every Docker file or every Docker container that you write inside of this Docker file can have an entry point. And that entry point is a script or command that runs on boot up, on startup. And at the minute, there's nothing inside of this container. The file system has nothing on it. So we can't define an entry point. So we're going to use the copy instruction. This is going to allow us to copy a file from our action package over to the Docker containers file system. And convention is to use entry point as the file name to make it clear that this is where the action's starting. We're going to put it over to the root of the file system. And we'll call it the same thing. Don't worry, this file doesn't exist yet. We're going to get to creating that in a second. And like I said before, we have an entry point. So you use the entry point instruction and sort of like an array syntax here. We're going to specify the file that it needs to run. So we'll use that entry point.sh file that we just copied over. Now, if we go back to this action.yaml file, there's an args key down here. And you can probably guess what it does. It literally lets you provide a string of arguments that will be passed through to that entry point. And we defined the name key up here. And just like you would in a workflow, you have this sort of interpolation syntax. And inputs is quite literally pointing to this inputs up here. And we're saying we want the value of name. And we want to pass that through to our entry point file. So again, let's create a new file over here. And we'll just fill in this entry point.sh. Again, don't worry if you're not very familiar with shell scripting. I know a lot of people are, but some people aren't because they just don't use it very often. We're going to be creating a shell script. I'm going to put a shebang or shebang, however you want to say it, up here. And this is going to tell the OS or the kernel which application to execute this shell script under. And because Alpine is very minimal, we'll be using bin.sh. So this just points to the default shell. Doesn't matter what one's configured, as long as it's, shell compliant, bash compliant. Cool. So let's get this a really simple test. Let's just echo something out. So let's just echo hello. In your terminal, I'm not sure what's happening there. In your terminal, you're going to want to make sure this file is executable. So we're going to chmod +x. This makes it executable. And now if I run this inside of my shell, you can see that hello is output. And this is what we're expecting to happen inside of the workflow. We'll create that in just a second. So like I said, we're passing through arguments. And this is just like executing the script inside of your own terminal and passing through an argument here like this. So I might pass through my name, Ryan. At the minute, we're not doing anything, but the shell script is going to receive this as an input argument. And now in the land of shell, we can access that using $1, meaning the first argument that is passed in. Technically, there is $0, but that's going to refer back to the script name itself. So if I run this again, you can see we're outputting hello Ryan. Very basic sort of shell 101. You can have that for free. Cool. So with the action.yaml set up and pointing to this Docker file, we're copying over the entry point into the root of the file system in the container, and we're instructing the container to execute that upon startup or boot. So let's get a basic GitHub workflow going now. So like you would anywhere else, we'll create that .github folder, and we will create a workflows folder just inside of there. And let's just call this example.yaml, just for now. This is fine. Cool. Let's start at the very top. So we need an on, and we're going to say on push. So every time we push to the repository, it's going to execute this workflow. And as well as on, we want to specify some jobs. We're not going to worry about the name and all of that metadata for now. We're going to get right to the point and just go straight in with the jobs. So I'm going to create an example job here. And we want this to run on into latest, just for now. This doesn't affect how the custom action runs at all. It's executed inside of a Docker container. So it doesn't matter. It's a completely separate image. Let's just call this an example job as well. So this will be output on the actions page. We can see exactly what point in time we're in. I'm also going to add in a concurrency key. So this is experimental at the minute, the concurrency. It's subject to change. It's not a finalized API. So you can see the description up here. It ensures that only a single job or workflow using the same group will run at a time. So if you push very close together and two of these workflows get dispatched, only one of them is allowed to run at a time, so you don't have any overlap. You can even cancel existing ones or ones that are already running and run this one. So we will do that. We'll give it a group name first. Call it example job. So this is a unique identifier. If GitHub finds a workflow that's already running or a job that's already running that has this group name, it will cancel it or prevent this one from running. And we'll cancel in progress. We'll set that to true. And now we can go down to the steps. So the steps again are what we saw before on the slides. It's each action that we're going to be running. They run sequentially. So let's put one in. Let's give it a name. And we want to check out our repository. So we'll use this action. This is an action that GitHub themselves provide for checking out the repository. It handles all of the private repository access and the GitHub token and stuff like that. It's an authorized action. It can access the repository fine, whether it's public or private. And it's worth noting here that I'm saying at v2. This is sort of the general way that people will do it, but you can either specify a more granular tag, or you can even put the SHA for a commit here as well. And that just lock down the version of the action that you're using. So this is fine. We can leave this now. And let's add in another step. And we'll just call this one say hello. So this is where we're actually going to sort of employ our own action that we've written. So we'll give it a name and we'll say users as well. Because the action exists inside of this same repository, the repository that we've just checked out, we can actually just point to a relative path. So we're saying in the current directory of the repository, which is where our Docker file, it's where our action.yaml file is, as well as our entry point. And we don't actually need to say anything else if you don't have any required arguments. But if you remember, we have this single argument that is required. So we need to pass a value through for that. So we'll use the with key like you would in any other action that requires arguments. We'll say name, and let's just put PHP SW in there for now. Cool. So this is a very basic workflow. If I just, we'll go up and commit this quickly, just do a whip commit. Great. If we head over to Safari, I refresh the page and I go to Actions, we can see here that this whip commit has triggered the action to run because it was on push. And if we step into it, we can see each of these steps execute as well. So it's taken a second to start here. You know, the output is going to be very simple from this because we're just echoing out. So whatever we echo out from the action is going to be put right inside of this output block here. And you can see that has worked. I'll wait for the job to finish quickly. We're nearly there. Perfect. So let's go into the output. Let's take a deeper look at what's happening. So it's seeing the arguments that we provided, and it's also filling in this greeting because we gave it a default value. We're building the Docker image. So it's found the Docker file. It's found it in the root of the repository, and it's pulling the Alpine image in from the Docker server remotely. We're copying the entry point file over to the root of the file system. So it's available to the Docker container. And we're saying to run that as the entry point script. So as soon as that container is ready to go, it will invoke that script and it will pass through the arguments that we specified earlier. And just like that, it runs the script and we get our output down here. Simple enough. But again, this is just a shell script. Shell is not nice to write. You know, it's not a C-style language. You have weird if statements with square brackets around. It's not the most pleasant language. It's fast, but it's not pleasant. So in a lot of cases, you'd want to use a language that you're familiar with, which is where PHP comes into it. So let's go back and let's start looking at how to implement a PHP action. So the first step is going to be in entrypoint.sh. We can completely get rid of this file because we're not going to be running a bash script anymore. Instead, let's create a new file called entrypoint.php. And I'm actually going to use another shebang up here. And all I'm saying is I want to look inside of the environment and pull out the PHP binary, whatever one is currently in the path. And let's open up our PHP tags. And we'll leave this for the time being because we actually want to go back and tell Docker to run this PHP file. So there's a couple of options you can use here. You can either go through GitHub, find a Docker image that has PHP support, Composer support. You know, if you need PHP FPM, you can find images with that as well. But the PHP, the Docker community on PHP and the organization for PHP on Docker actually has some pre-built images that come with PHP and are built on Alpine. So we're going to be using one of them. So we're going to say from the PHP org, or from the PHP image, we want to use the CLI Alpine tag. And this is just going to pull the latest. There are versions where you can lock down the, there are tags that you can lock down the PHP version with. This is going to pull the latest, which I believe will be 8.0.4.5. It will just be whatever the latest and greatest is. Cool. And if we look down here, we can change entrypoint.sh to entrypoint.php. We can do the same thing here. And we can also change this to PHP. Now, again, I need to make this file executable. So I'm going to say chmod plus x, we'll say entrypoint.php. And now, just like I did with that shell script, I can go down here and execute this straight away. We didn't get any errors. It ran the file through PHP because of this shebang at the top. Let me close my terminal. Because of this up here. When we invoke that script on the CLI, it knows to look inside of our environment and find the PHP binary and run the file through that. So let's just do another test. Let's just say echo hello. If I run this again, we get the hello output. And we can tidy this up by putting PHP EOL in the end and single quotes because I'm not a monster. Great, there we go. So we're getting hello. We've not got the weird escape character at the end. We've just got a new line and we're back in our terminal. So this is all ready to go. I mean, right now we could push this back up to GitHub. It would run nicely, but we've not accessed any input arguments yet. Remember before we had that $1 inside of the shell script. So there's a couple of ways to do this. A really simple way is to use the global argv array. And now I know globals are frowned upon unless you're a WordPress developer. But PHP uses this. I don't think it will ever go anywhere. And it's the simplest way to pull in any arguments passed to the command. So in this case, the 0 index in this array is going to be the name of the script. So we can just, we'll just var dump this out for now. So if I run this, you can see entry point 0 is, index 0 is the entry point script. It's just whatever we've written up here. And if we dump out the entire argv and pass through that Ryan again, you can see that we receive that as well, just like we did in the shell script, except this time we're pulling it out of an array instead of using the $0, $1 syntax. Right. And this is the same thing that's going to happen when we run it on GitHub Actions, because we're passing it through inside of that args string down here. Right. So let's echo out. We'll say hello again with a space, and we'll say argv1. It's worth noting that because this is a global variable made available by PHP, if you're inside the context of a function, which you might be, depends on how you structure this. If you're inside the context of a function, you'll need to declare global argv first, and then you can use it. It's exactly the same thing. You just need that global declaration. Cool. So let's give this a whirl. Let's do another whip commit, because who doesn't love a whip commit? We'll head back over to GitHub. If we go to Actions, it's running again because we've pushed to the repository, and we'll step through here again. So we'll wait for the output. I'll take a quick sip. Perfect. Great. So the output is exactly the same. The benefit here is that we don't have to set up PHP ourselves because the Docker image has done it. We've still got the same arguments. Remember, name is being passed through as the first positional argument to the PHP script. We've copied PHP over. PHP is already installed, so we can just execute that script normally. And we didn't need to specify to run it through PHP because of that shebang, that weird comment at the top of the file. Great. So I said there was 2 ways of accessing input arguments. argv is the first way, and if it's a simple script, I would recommend using this way. The only time that this isn't nice is if you've got multiple inputs. So in the action, remember, we had 2 inputs. Now I could pass greeting through down here in the args. I could put a space there and I could say inputs.greeting, and then this would drop into this the second index, or sorry, the third index, but index 2 in the argv array. But the issue is you have, 8 or 9 inputs for this action, depending on what sort of action it is. Like the auto commit one, there's I think nearly 10 or 11 different inputs. You don't want those to be in a particular order. You add a new input, I need to come down into the args, I need to make sure it's being passed through. So instead, GitHub will pass these through as environment variables. So we can see this in action. PHP has a super global called env, and you can pull things out just like you would in an application where you use the env function. That will at some point load everything out of this super global. So let's just var dump this. Let's push this back up to GitHub. Remember, our input's already coming in. We've added greeting as well, and the default value is hello. So let's see what this environment looks like. So we'll go back up and we'll run this here. So far, this is relatively simple, I think. You don't need lots of experience with Docker. You can use PHP. You don't even need to use a shell script. PHP is perfectly fine. Let's go into say hello. And we've dumped out the env superglobal here. If we scroll down, you can see GitHub's put in a few of its own things in the environment. These will be things that are set on the CLI. If you don't know, you can prefix. If I run this script, actually, we'll be able to see the environment's empty. But if I say, app env equals CI, and then I run it, it's still empty for some reason. Not sure why. That should technically work. But you can see GitHub's putting some of these in. So we've got GitHub Actions. We're saying it's true. We know this is running through GitHub Actions. So if there's things that you want to test locally, you could check to see if GitHub Actions was false. If we scroll down a little bit more, we've got some inputs here. We've got input underscore name. So now we don't need to dig into argv. Instead, we can look into the environment and do a bit of string formatting and pull out all of our arguments exactly the same way. Let's do this. So I'm going to use a variable here for the key. So we saw before it was input like this, and in our case, it's name. So if you've defined the input as name here, if you had an underscore here, name of person, let's change it to that just for now. You'd come in here and you just uppercase the entire input name. Let's go back to name for now. So this is the key, and this is the value. We're going to look inside of the env array, and we're going to pull out that key. And if we now echo out hello and the value, this will achieve exactly the same thing. But now we can use those keys, those names that we've already given to the inputs to access them. We haven't got to make sure that the args are in the right order. One more thing that you can do, like I said before, you add a new input, you probably deploy it, run some tests, and you're like, oh, where's the value? It's not coming in. It's probably because you've forgotten to add it to this arg string down here. Now we can actually delete this arg string completely. We don't need it anymore because those environment variables are being set. We don't need to pass through positional arguments. So now if we do a quick commit, and we'll let this run in the background, let's just take another scroll through here. So we've got some other environment variables. We've got the greeting up here as well, which we'll look at in a second. We keep on running. We've got the OS that it's being run on, which is Linux. We've got some actions specific stuff here. So we've got like the server URL of GitHub. You can use this to figure out if someone's running it on GitHub Cloud, you know, the public cloud hosted GitHub, or if you've got it on a self-hosted server. We've got the actor. So this is the person that did the commit, that triggered the workflow. In this case, it's my username. We've got the workflow file itself. We've got the action itself again. We can keep on scrolling down. We've got access to the repository, which is great. If you need to make an API request and retrieve a particular repository's information, if you've got access to that API, you can do here. Just take this part or both parts. You haven't got them. Make sure that it's being retrieved as input. There's some more stuff down here. We're running PHP 803. All of this stuff doesn't really matter. The bit that you're going to be concerned with or be using at all is the GitHub stuff. This should have run by now. It's still running. Hopefully that doesn't mean GitHub's having issues. I think it was just being a bit slow. Okay, so say hello, and still, we've got the same output as we did before. Let's jazz this up a little. Let's start changing the greeting. So let's go into example.yaml, and we'll add the greeting here, and we'll say, what's a good greeting? Yo. Why not? Let's say yo. And again, if this isn't provided, it will default back. Let's remove the space. So we can come up here, just refactor this. We'll echo env input greeting. We'll put space between them. And now we'll echo out input name. And we can commit this back up and look at this in a second. There's a couple more things I want to talk about. So like I said before, this is a very basic, it's a very basic Docker file. There's no composer. If you need to auto load stuff, there's no composer, anything like that. What there is package managers. So just like you can with Ubuntu, Debian, Arch, you can install stuff. You can still execute curl requests. So any dependencies that you need for your action to run, perhaps image manipulation, video manipulation, maybe you want to run FFmpeg, you can get all of this inside of Alpine still. I would recommend Alpine as the image for these Docker files because it's so lightweight. There's not loads of startup stuff going on. If we head over to the action, it's finished running. We'll take a look. We'll scroll down, and we've also got this yo. So this is being passed through from the workflow itself. There are a couple of other things you can do inside of your action. You can set outputs. I won't cover those here because it's a bit more complex. There's a bit more syntax knowledge needed. You need to understand the underlying syntax, but you can do that stuff. You can set outputs so that later on in somebody's workflow, they can retrieve the value that came out of that output and use it in their own string, in their own action, sorry. A couple of best practices. I generally like to have some sort of main function. This is more from a scope perspective. If for whatever reason something happened to the action, all of the logic for the action is wrapped inside of this function. So the scope is blocked. You've not got global variables, anything like that. There's no chance of conflicts. This is a very C, Rust, Go sort of thing where you've got this main entry point function. But for something like this, where you only want something to happen in a certain scenario, in a certain scope, this is perfect. And you can utilize helper functions. And this is something that I've been working on. So I'm going to open up a quick repository here. So I've been working on a little system called Actum, which is Latin for action, very cliche name. I've got some composer stuff here. So we can go into the Docker file. And this will get a lot more minimal. It will be tidied up. But I'm still running on that Alpine PHP image. I'm installing Composer using the curl command. You can find this in the docs. And I'm copying some extra stuff across. So I'm copying source at the minute. This is where all of the package and the library's code is. I've got this action.php file. I've got the composer and the composer lock file, and I'm running composer install. And if we take a look at the action here, it's very minimal at the minute. And on purpose, I'm sort of building this up in stages. But if you look at the JavaScript library that GitHub provide, they provide all of these helper functions for retrieving input, setting output. So you haven't got to have any understanding of the underlying stuff. It's all wrapped in named functions, which is great, I think. But the problem is it's restricted to JavaScript. Like I've showed you, you can use PHP for these actions just with Docker and an image. So I'm working on a package, a very simple, lightweight package that you can put in through Composer. And I'll probably provide like a little boilerplate or template for building these actions with PHP. But if I look at the implementation here, it's doing basically the same thing I've just showed you. It's looking into the env at the minute. I'll probably pull in the env helper. It's a bit safer. You can define default values, transform Boolean values as well. If you didn't know YAML, you can say true, false, true in all caps. Sometimes they might come through as strings, or if you explicitly define a string as true, it won't be a Boolean in the application, it will be the string true. So we transform to Boolean values. You can check if input exists. You haven't got to do any of these nasty checks yourself. And there will eventually be output helpers. But this is something that I'm working on. If you follow me on Twitter, I'll announce it there. I'll probably do some teasers, some blog posts as well. But if you're actually interested in writing actions with PHP, this will probably be the library that you want, so you haven't got to do all of that reaching out yourself. And yeah, everything runs inside of this main function, just like I showed you. It's sort of a practice that I'm following. And I think that just about rounds up my talk, to be fair. We've covered quite a bit in half an hour or so. Hopefully it wasn't too fast. Hopefully I didn't confuse you too much either. Like I said, you don't need to have a broad understanding of all of these concepts, just enough to get you to the PHP stage. And then it's everything that you're familiar with, which is great. So thank you for listening. Thanks for having me. And if you've got any questions, please ask away.
Cool. Thanks, Ryan. It's really interesting stuff again. Just have a look in the chat, see if we can see anything.
Yeah, sure.
Any questions? I suppose the other thing, typically if I was writing a Docker file and I wanted to get Composer, as well as doing like an APK add or an app install, usually I would do like a copy from, and I can pull the Composer binary from the actual Composer image that way. Could you do that in an action in the same way, or do you have to go through a package manager?
No, you can do anything in a Docker file you would anywhere else. Like you say, if you're writing a Docker file in a Drupal project or a Laravel project, you can do whatever. I generally prefer sticking with a package manager route, purely from a flexibility point of view. I'm not restricted to that action or that image, like you say, you're copying from.
Yeah. Suppose you might have the slightly image, like a slightly older version of Composer or something from a package manager. So swings and roundabouts, I guess.
Yeah, there's probably pros and cons to both.
I don't see any questions in the chat. I don't know if anybody
hopefully it wasn't too fast. I felt like I was really speeding through it.
That's all good stuff.
I get carried away.
Were you still working? Last time we spoke, you were working on a video course or a course subscription on Actions. Is that still a thing you're working on?
Yeah, it's like half recorded, half not recorded. I've sort of the basics are recorded. Getting your first workflow up and running, and then I had a whole segment on more advanced techniques that you can use, like the screenshotting sort of stuff, browser testing, screen recordings of actions running, but I never got that far. Maybe I'll release the first half and do it in dribs and drabs, but
yeah, I've been writing a book on automated testing in Drupal for a while, and I sort of pick it up and do a little bit and then put it down again. But I spend more time writing the example app than I have done writing the words.
Yeah, that's it.
So far.
So, I mean, life gets in the way. That's my issue.
So there's nothing in chat. I don't know if anybody does have a question they want to unmute themselves and just ask or post in the chat if you have any questions. Okay, take that as no. Right, thanks, Ryan. Brilliant.
No worries.
But if there's any questions people think of afterwards, they can Twitter or websites, probably the best place.
Yeah, it's well. Yeah.
Cool.